Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Richard Martin. I'm Director of Education and Public Programmes here at the Whitechapel Gallery, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our discussion this evening, Making Spaces, which is presented in partnership with the Architecture Foundation. It's great to see you here in our auditorium, and a warm welcome to those of you joining our live stream. So, here at the Whitechapel, we've been thinking a lot about studios recently, about how artists have utilised and satirised and reimagined these semi-mythic spaces. And you can see a dizzying range of representations and recreations of studio life by an international array of artists in our current exhibition, A Century of the Artist Studio, which runs here until early June. And you can make your own artistic masterpiece in the Living Studio, which is a participatory space adjacent to the exhibition, filled with inspiring objects and materials. Running alongside the exhibition here, our friends at the Architecture Foundation have developed a brilliant series of conversations and films exploring the rich typology of artist studios and the contemporary challenges of delivering studio provision. You can see those presentations on the Architecture Foundation's YouTube channel, and there's a link to them on the event page for tonight's discussion. But with all of this in mind, how might we assess the provision of studios and other creative spaces in our cities today? What role can architects, urban designers, and civic and community organisations play in creating and supporting artistic practices? What new, innovative and equitable models of studio provision are emerging? And of course, how has the pandemic reshaped the opportunities and the obstacles for making creative spaces? We have a terrific lineup of panelists with us tonight to help us consider these vital, complex questions. We're joined by the architect, Astrid Smitham, co-founder of the East London practice APPARATA, whose work has particularly focused on the provision of community and cultural spaces. Their projects include the Old Manor Park Library in Newham, and most recently a House for Artists, also in Newham, which combines low-rent housing with studio provision and a community arts centre. And you may also have seen APPARATA's work here at the Whitechapel Gallery as part of the group exhibition Is This Tomorrow in 2017. Joining Astrid is Yves Blais, who is operations manager at the Creative Land Trust, which is an organisation founded to tackle the lack of affordable space for artists and other cultural workers in London and beyond. Yves has worked at the Trust since its inception 5 years ago, manages the property portfolio, and is currently leading the tendering process and the fit-out for new spaces in Hackney and Newham. There's lots happening in Newham recently, as we can see. And our discussion this evening is chaired by Holly Lewis, who in 2006 co-founded We Made That, an award-winning practice of architects, urban designers, and researchers. We Made That work exclusively for the public sector and charities with offices in London and Manchester. And Holly and the team have received particular acclaim for the thoughtful, imaginative and ethical way that they've approached working with urban communities. And amongst everything else, Holly is also a National High Street Task Force expert, the Mayor's Design Advocate for the GLA, and a Design Council Built Environment expert. We're thrilled to have Holly, Yves and Astrid with us tonight, and I want to thank all of them for taking the time from their busy schedules to join us. And I want to thank Ellis Woodman and the team at the Architecture Foundation for their wonderful collaboration on tonight's event and the related series of films. Our panellists will share and discuss ideas supported by some images for about an hour, and then there will be a chance for you to ask questions and to join the conversation. And we ask if you could wait for the microphone to reach you at that crucial moment. That would be especially appreciated so that our online audiences can also hear your contribution. We'll finish here in the auditorium about 8:30, but our bookshop and our exhibitions here are open until 9 o'clock this evening. Lastly, I'd like to remind you that if you're comfortable and able to wear a face mask in our auditorium, we'd encourage you to do so. That's all from me. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening. And please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Astrid Smitham, to Yves Blais, and first of all, to Holly Lewis.
Thanks very much, Richard, for a really great introduction and actually doing all of my work for me. So I don't have to do any of the introduction to you guys because everybody already knows who you are. And thanks for joining. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. We've already started, if I'm being honest, in the session before. So I'm really interested to hear from both Astrid and Yves about their various experiences and to, I guess, draw out some of our learning as well. So just by way of a little bit of introduction, we have been thinking about artist studios in London specifically for quite a long time. We first did a study in 2014, mapping artist workspace across the city. We updated that in 2017, and we're just in the process of updating again now that kind of evidence base. So I'll be chucking in some findings from that as we go through. But I think let's just get stuck in. Mm-hmm. We're going to have a little bit of a presentation from each, Astrid and Yves. Astrid, I think you're going first, just to talk us a bit through your work. So I'll just hand over to you.
Okay, thanks. Hello everyone, I'm Astrid Smitham, architect and co-founder of APPARATA. So we work closely with artists both in collaborations and creating studio space and living space for artists. So we're interested in ideas around what you fix in place when you build something and what you leave open. So we try to design for unknown futures. And that means we try to design for spaces that can host many things rather than just one, and allow for built-in adaptability and ways to use space differently. So I'm going to introduce 3 projects that we've worked on. The first is Manor Park Library. So this was a reuse project to create studio space and public space in a former Carnegie library. Then called Old Manor Park Library. Sorry. This is the street-facing library room in the 90s. There was a timber and glass partition that was typical of Edwardian buildings, which is a device that both connects and divides spaces. This is how it looked when we got hold of it. The glass and timber arch had gone. The building had been left empty for several years and was starting to rot, a lot of damp issues. So the brief was to create a public space at the front and studios at the middle and the back, but the public had to be able to access amenities at the back. So the public had to be able to cross a private, secure studio area. So it was this physical crossover suggested that those studios would be more public. And typically these types of conversions would be a narrow plasterboard corridor that diminish a connection between visitors and artists. So we reinstated the glass and timber arch and extended the glass and timber partitioning to create a large light common room that could be used for working, for shared meals, for children to store their coats when there's an event on. It became a central meeting place for the artists in the building and between the artists and the local community. So it also has built-in flexibility that if you rent a 5 square metre studio, because perhaps that's what you can afford, you can expand into a 40 square metre space if you need to. So we believe that the public and community spaces deserve the best possible workmanship and materials and quality to respect community, and that public spaces shouldn't speak of austerity. This is the common room. We think any shared spaces should be pleasant places to reside so that chance encounters are more likely and happen in a place where you can stay and make meaningful connections. The studios are transparent, so the whole plan receives daylight, but you can also hang up boards to modify the privacy levels. So these studios attracted artists that already had a more public practice, and the partitions were used for display. And they suited artists that wanted a strong connection to the public space, and that might form part of their practice. So this is Rabbits Road Institute, led by resident artists and Create London. And upstairs, there were more private studios to suit artists with other needs. Each studio had a smooth wall and a structured one that could be used for storage. The next project is the White House, a former farmhouse on the Becontree estate in Dagenham. It's an estate that has many wonderful aspects, but also lacks community spaces or amenities. It's a type of urban planning that presupposes certain roles for men and women and a certain family structure. And from the outset, it had rules against working in the home. So in this setting, the White House is a project about celebrating domestic space as a place of artistic production. The idea is that the building is a house, it's a home for 2 resident artists, and it's also a public art space and a place of work. So it's spent time as an age concern before being left empty for many years. So again, suffering from damp and rot. This is the connection to the garden. So when we took over the building, it had a lot of partitions, a corridor with separate cul-de-sac rooms. We stripped the building out and added cuts that restored the connectivity that was more typical of a farmhouse when the building would have been used for working and living. And that allowed for different through routes and different configurations for events. Each room took on the role of a room in a house, a living room, dining room, front room, kitchen, while simultaneously being public-facing studios. And the artists decide how often the house would be public. Upstairs, the rooms become gradually more private, with semi-private studios and then fully private bedrooms. So these are the most public rooms, the new connection to the garden, the dining room, which is also a workshop. And then these are some of the different activities: shared meals, drama rehearsals, tea and cake, or painting class. And that's just a few of the activities. And then as you go upstairs, it becomes more private, the studios and then the bedrooms. So the last project is the one we've completed recently, which is the House for Artists in Barking, and that was for Create London, Be First, and London Borough of Barking Dagenham, and the GLA. So this combines places for artists to live and to work, as well as public art space. It's close to an extremely active high street. The empty plot is the site. And it's on the site of a former post-war estate that was demolished, and there's a new housing estate made up of blocks and pitched roof houses. So a priority for us was to design for agency through the inherent properties of the building itself. And by that we mean how much agency the occupants have over the space when the build is finished and into the future. And we think that agency has to be built into the floor plan and into the construction details, as well as into the agreements that the occupants sign when that allow them to have ownership over the spaces. And that's even if they're renting temporarily. So the walls, they're patras, so you can drill into them, and you can hang things from the ceiling, you can move the kitchen. And we wanted the plan to be inherently adaptable in a way that apartments seldom are. So the plan shows a walkway to the north and to the south. That means there's a direct fire escape from every room. And that means that the plan is free to have rooms or walls added and removed. There's no central corridor taking up space. So there's some variations that you could have just 2 large rooms, a 2-bed family apartment, or you can split that living space to create a working space, or reconfigure the shape of the apartment plan to have a shoot-through room. So while we wanted to allow for agency and adaptability, we still have to operate within norms. And as a result, the apartments, they don't exceed national space standards, but by not having a corridor, the apartments feel much bigger. And you can use that space to add a room. So if you have another child, you need to make a studio, or there's someone that you need to care for, you can adapt to those unknown futures. And people don't have to constantly make changes, but the adaptability is there if you need it. So that's the same space with a room added. And this is the shared walkway. This can be furnished. That was worked out with the fire strategy early on, and that was so that it could be a meaningful communal space where people could work or have meals together. And the windows are positioned at a height where the sill can also become a seat. So on one floor there's an optional form of co-housing where people can open the double doors in the party wall, and when they're closed they perform acoustically like a party wall. This can be used for shared practices between artists as a way of multiplying the space that they have to work in, or they can be used for shared childcare, or it can be used for extended family living models that go beyond the idea of a nuclear family. They wanted the building to read as a public building and have presence against the many towers that are near the building, with a legible stacked tectonic and also playful shapes that indicate where other functions are taking place. The triangular form here allows for a double height studio. The concrete is 50% GGBS and is a single skin which is structural. So this means there's no doubling up of heavy materials, so the overall carbon actually comes in below the REBA 2030 target. So we thought of the public space as essentially capturing part of the street, that the building is set back to create a wider pavement than previously. There are covered areas where people can shelter from the rain, and the idea is you can see what's happening before you go in, so there's a lower threshold to entry. So the ground floor will be programmed by the artists that are living there, and they then get 65% of market rate for their rent. And the final layout of the ground floor is currently being worked out with the artists. So there will be some partitions, and we'll be working on that with them for the next few months. So always the plans were thought of in terms of where you can work, whether it's public facing or shared studio or private studio, shared spaces. In the apartments, function neutral rooms, so you can decide if you bring a guest to your apartment whether you're bringing them to a studio space or to a living space or something ambiguous. So here's some of the other spaces, the double height space, or an outdoor space high up. So for us, these projects are all linked, like part of an ongoing work into topics of art and community, each specific to their location but connected. And it's about how to allow for generosity and agency within a regulatory, economic and constructural norms that don't necessarily always welcome that. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Astrid. I think it's really great to kind of see behind some of those images, which are familiar and that we definitely look at often. So thank you. Yves, shall we come to you next to talk about something a bit less architectural and a bit of something else?
I haven't got quite so many designs in my presentation.
There's a lot of slides.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yves Blais. I'm the operations manager at Creative Land Trust. We're an organisation, quite a young organisation, that was set up to protect affordable workspace in perpetuity in London. We are supported by the Mayor of London, Arts Council England, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and Outset Contemporary Art Fund. And we were set up off the back of a number of studies that came out, I suppose, over the last 8 years, namely by the Arts Council and the Greater London Authority. One in particular actually is the one that Holly was mentioning earlier, the Artist's Workspace Study, which surveyed the landscape of studios across London in 2014 and 2017, and showed that of the 11,500 studios in London, approximately, only a very small percentage, about 13% of them, were owned in freehold and secured, which meant that the rest were at the mercy of increasing rents, as rents do in London, and short-term leases, which sometimes come to an end, and then therefore the studios have to shut, which means that the spaces that are left were becoming more and more unaffordable. So really the way to try and combat that, it was thought, was to create an entity that could take on freeholds and provide space in perpetuity. You may know the creative industries in London, in the UK, is a huge section of the economy. 56 billion pounds contribute annually in the UK economy. In London, 1 in 6 jobs is in the creative industries. And every year, 30,000 graduates from art and design colleges leave London colleges every year. And artists and makers sit within the creative industries as a really important part that need protecting within it. And so off the back of that, the Creative Land Trust was devised by those founding partners. So we're an independent charity. We were set up in 2019 with the purpose to secure permanent workspaces across London, and hopefully in future outside of London as well in other cities, to provide truly affordable workspace for the sector, to be run by studio providers, of which there is a huge number in London already, about over 150. So our model is essentially to fundraise and acquire with those funds properties all over London, to start with at least. These are then let to studio providers who are expert in the field at running studios, who in turn rents the studios to artists at very affordable rates. And this will hopefully allow for existing creative hubs, but also new creative hubs to pop up around London. And the figures there on the slide, that with that range of 11 to 19 pounds per square foot per annum, that's the range that the Workspace Study surveyed across London, what artists can really truly afford per year. And really, the average is around £14.30 or so. But essentially, artists, it seems that they can't pay any more than £19 a square foot. So it's our mission to provide space that won't be any more than that. And I'll come to our 2 live projects in a second, but essentially, we're looking across the whole of London, and there are areas of opportunity. For instance, the Mayor's creative enterprise zones, which are really interesting places where there could be opportunities to bring new studios and protect studios that are already there. But also there's places of need, both areas where there aren't so many artist studios, where hopefully we can bring more into the community. And likewise, spaces where there are plenty of studios, but they're at risk, and we want to try and protect those spaces. So on to our first site. So we're really pleased last year to be able to announce our first acquisition. So our founding funders were able to give us some money, some seed funding. And with that money, we went out and looked for an appropriate site. And Hackney Wick is one of those spaces that some may know. Historically, over the last 20 years, has had the densest population of artists, potentially even in Europe. And that's at threat with the kind of development going on in the local area. And this building on Wallace Road is being developed by Telford Homes. And it replaced studios that were run by Cell Studios, studio providers, on the original site, which was a kind of light industrial warehouse. And there was a planning condition that required the developer to re-provide the 33,000 square feet of workspace for artists. And so that's the spaces that we've bought. So whereas previously you might have high street coffee chains going into the ground floor of these units, we're going to be putting studios into the lower ground and ground floor. We've brought Cell Studios back into the picture, so they are going to be one of our studio providers, because we felt it was really important to create that continuity and be trying to bridge with the local community. And we're in the process of doing the fit out. So hopefully come the summer, we'll have working studios, which we'll be able to announce. Our second site is just, is it flicking through? That's it. Our second site is just across the borough border in Newham. Alice Billings House is a site we've taken on. It's owned by Newham Council, and we've taken on a lease, so Newham is our landlords. The building itself is split into two parts, 2 blocks mirroring buildings, and it's been sitting empty for the last approximately 15 years, with holes in the roof and pigeons as inhabitants. And it sits just behind Stratford Town Hall. And through a tender process, we put forward a bid that would turn these rooms, which were previously dormitories for the old fire stations, firefighters, when West Ham Fire Station was just adjacent, into studios for artists in the local area. And at the ground floor, there's also the potential for a kind of event space, come exhibition and cafe space, which will allow a real interface for the local Newham population to come and sort of experience what's happening in the building, but also for the tenants in the building to come down and have a kind of meeting space. Again, this is a massive refurbishment project, and we're fundraising to get this building back up and running. But we've got the money to get the first phase of work, the first phase happening, which will get all of the studios up and active. And the first part of that is a kind of meanwhile use in one of the buildings, which will hopefully get about 15 to 20 artists working in there by the summer. So we're set up, we had some initial funding that allowed us to acquire our first property, but over time we're looking at creating a blended finance model. So to begin with, and with our case studies that we're trying to get up and running, we will be going out for donations and getting grant money in to get those things live. Once we've got the 2 buildings up and running, and as the portfolio starts to build out, we'll be looking at other sources of funding. So potential investment from social impact investors is one way where they expect a kind of patient return over many, many years because of the very small returns we'll be able to provide. And of course, there'll be a small marginal operating surplus that comes from running the buildings. But also we look at strategic partnerships. And so, for instance, our partnership with Newham, who are, of course, our landlord, but have a shared set of values, is a really interesting way of trying to kind of garner interest and get more people engaged. And we also will be working at policy work and trying to influence through campaigning and getting developers and investors really interested in understanding the real benefit of having a creative workspace in their locality. And one of these projects is, one of the ways we do this is through commissioning research. This piece of research was published in September 2021 by Hawkins Brown and Dataloft. And what we wanted here was to put a real solid value on the presence of creative workspaces in new developments. And so we asked the researchers to look at different creative clusters across London, but also in the Thames estuary. And through that research and across a period of 10 years, they were able to deduce that on average, the inclusion of workspaces in new developments will make the value of the actual residential properties go up by 4.4% approximately on average per year. So that's really helpful when we're speaking to developers to go, creative workspace isn't just useful to make an area feel good, it actually has a tangible result to it too. But also as tenants and as neighbors, creative workspaces are great for the local community. Our work obviously won't just focus on the financial benefit. We're really interested in what the social impact is of workspaces in the city. And so with our buildings, we'll be looking to measure the impact of the spaces. So from anything from the financial stability that they bring to the artist tenants through having a permanent workspace, right through to the access that's provided to the local community and potential engagement and opportunities to learn about art making and and art production. So that's a kind of summary of what we are and what we do. Essentially, this sort of cycle of trying to bring buildings up and running, get them working, and then fundraising and through the campaigning, actually getting people interested so that we can put more money back into the portfolio and build it further across London, and as I said, hopefully in the years to come across the UK. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks both. I think really complementary presentations covering completely different aspects of the same type of thing, from money and how we make that work to how these spaces are lovely to inhabit and the different ways in which they might be inhabited. What I am thinking of, though, as I'm hearing from you both, is there's this background picture of threat to studios in the city, and I think that's borne out by the studies that we've undertaken as well, which showed actually in 2014 around 28% of the studios that we had information about were not expecting to be able to renew their leases within 5 years. It's like 30% of the studios are somehow threatened, which is a difficult environment to be practicing in and kind of destabilising, I imagine. That had actually decreased in 2017 to the figure that you referenced, which is that 17% at risk within 5 years. Still not great, though, if we're being honest. 17% is still quite a lot. And as I say, we're in the process of updating the study now, so we're interested to see what the picture of that looks like currently, because of the just threat everywhere you look right now. So this is kind of a difficult situation to be operating in. And I'm wondering, and this is a kind of deliberately provocative, and Astrid, I'm going to come to you first, but I think it will be interesting to hear from both of you. In that context of threat, do artists really care about architecture or what the kind of space is like? Or is it all about price? Is that the main driver for what we're looking at? I know, it's not an either-or situation, but just as a kind of provocation, does price drive everything with artist studios? What are the other things that we need to be thinking about? Astrid, I'm really interested to hear from you.
Well, I mean, you have to ask the artists, but from what we've heard from them, they have said that they do find particularly certain arrangements, and I'm not necessarily talking about whether things look nice or not, but particular arrangements being really valuable to them. And the example of the 5 square metre studio that can open out into a 40 square metre studio, that's a specific person who said that she's really grateful that that was possible, because that was all that she could afford, but it meant that she could work on a bigger scale. And that's, for me, is as much part of the architecture as the appearance. And so I think there's the element of the design and the quality, and wanting to have good quality public spaces. There's the functionality and being able to adapt your spaces and make them fit your needs. And that's all part of the architecture as well, which might be very cheap. In fact, sometimes making those decisions might actually be cheaper than the sort of standard fit out. And it's just about making those decisions with a certain kind of adaptability in mind, because all artists have different needs. So I'd say it is important. It just depends which part, different parts will be differently sort of valued.
I think it's a great answer, and actually I think the projects really demonstrate how those things are inherent within each other, that actually both, it can be complementary, not that one kind of dominates over the other. Yves, I don't know your position.
I think the flexibility point seems to be really important, because artist practice does change over time and their needs will change. So, we're constantly, with the fit outs that we're looking at the moment, looking at a very light touch approach, because that is the cheapest way to do it, but it's also the best way, because that blank canvas then allows for the tenants to go in and the artists to sort of use the space as well as they want. But clearly there are certain things that you need to provide, and you need to have safe spaces that are secure, dry spaces, lit spaces, and warm spaces if you can. And, often studios are not the warmest of places. So how can we do that and make really sustainable but light touch approach spaces that cater for a variety of different needs and types of practice.
I think this question about the quality of environment in a lot of existing artist studios almost makes me feel more positive about this kind of churn that we're seeing in the evidence, that actually quite a lot of studios are being lost, but then they're being re-provided, and we hope that the re-provision, whilst it's destabilising in that process, can be for better environmental performance, better kind of thermal performance, all of these things. It's really interesting. One of the other things that I was kind of refreshing my memory of in preparing for this was, it's a bit of a kind of haggard old quote now, but I looked it up, it's from 1987, so nearly as old as I am. This quote about artists being the shock troops of gentrification, which we hear, I think, again and again. It's like the first casualties of war, of gentrification in the city. So they're kind of going in there when prices are cheap, they're making somewhere really desirable, the prices rise, they get kicked out, there's this kind of recurring pattern. I think we're still slightly suckers for it. This sort of sense that bringing artists in will be optimistic and like we're an up-and-coming place. And I wonder, again, coming to you, Astrid, if your reflection on that in relation to Barking and Dagenham, is it because they're for the love of creative endeavour, or is it bringing in this sort of magic fairy dust that artists bring to areas of regeneration, of which Barking and Dagenham is obviously one? And then how do we feel about that? Because in the model that is being put forward and in the kinds of developments, Yves, that you're talking about, actually the studio space is kind of embedded in that new development. So it's less at threat. And have we finally found that right balance of bringing in artists as a sort of driver of regeneration and change in the city in a way that doesn't then mean that they also get pushed out afterwards? Query.
So, there's a few topics in there, and I think I suppose I've always had a problem with laying any blame at artists' feet for gentrification, because they are victims of the system that's also making it difficult for many other people to live in the city or stay in the city. So there's a problem with the over-financialisation of land and property. And so in terms of what's a good way of bringing artists into an area and what's a less good way, I mean, I think every project we've done has had a public component and has involved people who live locally. So with the library, that was built with a lot of local volunteers. So there was involvement throughout the whole process. So it was something that was expected, built on together, and is used in part by the public. So I suppose that's a way of connecting it to an area, so it's not entirely alien. And then I guess the last part is whether, are they the shock troops that then move on? And that all depends on the policy and how strictly it's maintained by the council, keeping things in perpetuity and making sure that, in House for Artists, they're not subject to right to buy. So, and Darren Rodwell from the council does believe strongly in the project. So there are people, the council is supporting it very strongly. So that should be protected in perpetuity.
It's interesting though then, Yves, because you're coming from a a direction of engagement with private sector investment, really, rather than being completely supported by councils, although there's public sector kind of backing for you. So is that important in this long-term security of artist workspace in the city?
Yeah, I think the narrative is starting to change. Developers are realizing, property sector is realizing that to make a holistic community that really works, you have to have a balance, and it's not just about packing as many new apartments into space and then leaving the sort of street empty. It's about a real mixture, and that's possible. You know, you can make the book's balance if you bring it in to the thinking very early on at pre-planning stage, and you involve the artist community and the local community in those discussions to say, you know, what is it you actually really need, so that you can engineer the spaces to get that flexibility that we were speaking about earlier, and inevitably keep the costs down so that everything kind of just fits. And yeah, I mean, I think getting the perpetuity in there is really important. If you can hold on to the spaces and create a stable place for artists that aren't going to have to then move on in 5 years' time, then people grow roots and they start shopping at the local hardware store and meeting at the local community centre or in the cafe in the building next door. And like any other sort of small business, you start to interact with the neighbourhood, or you're already there and you're then using this as a local facility. So I think that's really crucial, is that kind of localised approach.
I think it's really interesting, and this model of including artist workspace as part of a bigger mixed-use development. Clearly there are architects who are incredibly skilled at designing this kind of space, but are you worried that there are a lot of people who don't understand that? So I was really interested to hear about your consideration of privacy, of how the spaces work. Like, this is a space where you can store some stuff and then you've got a smooth wall as well, or you can drill into these walls anywhere you like. This is quite fine-grained level of understanding about how those spaces are going to be occupied. Are we asking too much of generic mixed-use development architect AX?
No. I think that's the level of consideration that should be given to every building. And I think there's, I suppose one thing we wanted to do was provide we wanted to build an example that we thought could be, have ideas within it that isn't just about artists, but contains things that are useful to everyone. I mean, everyone might have wanted to hang up some shelves in the past and then find they have like a crumbly plasterboard wall and they can't do it. And I mean, these are just considerations that it's fair for everyone to be able to drill into a wall. Everyone can use adaptability. It's important to have some slack in a plan, like some things you can change, that if your circumstances change, that your apartment can change with you, that you don't necessarily then have to move. And usually that kind of adaptability only comes if you own a home with a ground floor, a house. That's when you can extend. And I mean, another part of the model is that if two adjacent apartments agree, they can switch one room to belonging to the other apartment. So there's switch rooms. So you can actually extend and contract as well. And I think it's fair to think about these things with every kind of affordable housing building. Is what do people want and need, and how can we try to do the best we possibly can? And that applies to all architects.
I think it's fair enough. I'm wondering also just this dynamic between kind of pricing and accommodation. And it's really interesting to me that the House for Artists is housing as well as artist studio provision. And I think one of the things that we're hearing again and again, and it kind of keeps coming up, this dynamic with affordability, not just of the studio space itself, which obviously Creative Land Trust is trying to protect, but the affordability of housing as well, and how that plays into the space that there is for artists in London. Let's put it on London and just say how challenging that is. And I wonder if there's more to say, I mean, perhaps Eve, from your perspective on how that dynamic works and whether that changes where you might be looking at your studios, or, yeah, how do we tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, it won't work if we've got a whole population of artists commuting into London to use their studios. It just won't, that's not going to work. So there has to be a way of creating more space through affordable housing. We haven't yet quite got around to cracking that at the moment, but maybe, you know, watch this space in a few years. So we'll try and do the workspace thing first. But yeah, I think there needs to be a dialogue, because at the end of the day, a lot of artists are on very lumpy salaries or wages, where they might have an exhibition, and then, you know, there's a flurry of work that comes in from that, and then there's a kind of period of less of that, and so it's very difficult to understand where your income's going to be and for how long. So, you know, that we haven't got the solution for it yet, but at least with the rents of the workspace, hopefully we can get to a space where people still feel that they can be in London. And I think artists do want to be in London. There are a lot of people who are moving to Margate, and we hear stories about people moving to Dublin, to Lisbon, and other global cities where things are cheaper. But the galleries are all in London at the moment still, and so there's a dialogue there that needs to happen. And I think there will always be a place for artists in the city. We just have to crack exactly how to help them do that. How do you help them stay?
I think Astrid knows. You have an idea.
On the provision of affordable housing? Or?
Well, the House for Artists is such an interesting model, isn't it? And so unusual and idiosyncratic. And I wonder if you see that there's potential to roll it out, or, you know, how that extrapolates for you, or is it always this sort of beautiful, slightly unusual example?
So I think, in this particular model, it's tied to the rents are tied to the public programme that the artists provide. So there's an element of exchange, and that's still being defined and will be defined over the next 2 years, exactly what that means, exactly how much time, exactly what kind of programme. So, but I think it is possible to roll that model out. I think it's possible to roll it out without having a form of exchange as well. And that's all down to how things are financed, and it's with the right kind of interest rates on loans, for example. You can have buildings that pay for themselves on very low rents. And I think we just have to stop tying rents to market rate, because market rate doesn't mean anything. It's completely arbitrary. Things should be tied, if anything, to what things cost to build. And if you can make buildings pay for themselves through a low rent, then there should be absolutely nothing stopping us building lots of good affordable housing. But there's a persistence of this idea of market rate being a valuable measure. And as long as we do that, then we can talk about 80% or 65%. It's like 80% isn't necessarily affordable. So I think that's a measure that we just have to drop.
Agreed.
I like it.
I mean, there's other countries that already do that. Like, it's already, like in Switzerland, you talk of at-cost rent, and that means the rent is just what it costs to build, what it costs to maintain the building. That's it. And to me, that kind of makes sense, because that covers itself. You can't even talk of subsidies, because it's not subsidised.
And then you don't have this challenge of who's eligible for that, which I think is
there's no stigma, and I think stigma comes from the idea that social housing is in some way subsidised, when the reality is that a lot of social housing isn't in any way subsidised. You're only foregoing a massive profit, which isn't the same as a subsidy. So it's not costing anyone anything, you're just foregoing an extra chunk of cash on top, but it's still covering itself.
You did have the answer. I knew that
Yes,
you would,
I
and you
do.
did. That's great. What it's making me, I'm gonna ask one more question. It's just kind of for myself, really, and then I think it'll be interesting to hear from the audience. So get your questions ready, please. I couldn't do a talk without talking a little bit about high streets. And it hasn't come up so much so far, but it's interesting looking at artist studio providers' websites of what they're offering at the moment. There's the sort of typology of the artist studios in the bottom of a mixed-use block. There's the typology of kind of relatively old industrial sheds. And more, there's bits of high streets that we've been able to get our hands on, where this question of what the market will pay for it is all kind of fallen away because of COVID, and suddenly the whole retail portfolio is like, oh my God, it's not worth what we thought it was. And so this kind of space is becoming available. We have this issue of vacancy and sort of excessive space in some ways, in some high streets and town centres, not all of them. And then a need for space on the side of studios and artists. And that seems to be a really happy coming together in a lot of ways. And I was wondering if we learn anything from your respective kind of views and perspectives and project experience on how fruitful that relationship might be between the provision of artist studios and empty space on high streets. Yves, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, and I guess I can speak to it through the second project that I mentioned, the Alice Billings House site, which is kind of on a high street. It's slightly hidden away because it's behind the town hall and actually behind gates often. But it very much sits on a high street, the Broadway, which is Stratford's High Street. And Stratford High Street itself is, I guess you could say it is forgotten, because you've got the Olympic Park, which had a huge amount of investment that went into it back in 2012 and just prior to it. And Stratford High Street, it just hasn't had the same focus. And so I think the council has been really thinking through how to best serve the community there. And our proposal to turn Alice Billings House into 26 or 30 studios is a kind of kernel into what we think can happen there, because through a culture-led regeneration, you could potentially see, first in the absolute proximity where there are two other buildings that are owned by the council that aren't being used in their fullest potential, that could be spillover space if this project is really successful. And then there's the whole of the high street, and as you say, there's retail is changing, and where I think developers and property owners thought that retail was a sure fix for an income, that's falling away a bit at the moment, and people are a bit uncertain about the future of that. And in its place is coming workspace, and creative workspace is very much a part of that, especially because creative workspace does something different to what co-working does, in that it has a kind of much more animated, productive feel to it. There's sort of engagement that's happening. You know, if you could imagine that in a kind of shop window, and the idea of a shop actually having a kind of workshop at the back of it. So you can really see new activations that could start happening over the next few years. And I think it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of opportunity. We don't know how long it'll last, and that it goes back to that idea of the precariousness of the sector. How do we build in the perpetuity to make sure that these opportunities that are arising at the moment aren't just a flash in the pan thing, and then in 5 years' time, when the economy changes again, the creative space is swept away because something else is coming in that's more lucrative. So how do we create that perpetuity, and you know, are there new models of ownership that allow for that, to make sure that those spaces are held on to? But yeah, generally at the moment there's a swelling of optimism. I'm kind of touching wood, just hoping that it'll continue.
Yeah, I think historically a lot of, let's say, good times for artists have been where there has been an abundance of space through some mechanism that maybe deindustrialized cities have had industrial buildings that have become vacant and cheap, or there have been squats, or ways to live and work cheaply, which just hasn't been the case for a long time in London. And I think when changes happen, that can be a useful thing for artists. I guess we're not there yet. It's because I think a lot of the individual landlords are holding out for getting a decent rent in. So we have to see how that progresses, and what other kind of models of studio management there are when it's lots of small landlords potentially with small shops, or full department stores that get turned into studios. We'll see.
I know of a few of those.
I think there is a narrative. There's a conversation to be had with those property owners to make them see the value, and there's a shift happening at the moment. Some people are immediately jumping onto it, and you got a lot of examples of meanwhile opportunities where that's coming up. But yeah, I think over the next couple of years, you're going to see a lot of people trying to experiment with these different shapes of space. The department store is going to be quite an interesting one to see where that goes.
So a few challenges in front of us. I think so Hi-Fi studios are an interesting example of meanwhile space on high streets, aren't they? And this kind of model of, I guess not pepper potted, but scattered smaller spaces is a completely different model than the kind of typical Acme or Acava or whoever big artist studio provider type of thing. So it's interesting to see people testing that. And then the department store is a whole other thing yet again. We're yet to see, I think, a whole one taken over just as artist studios. I mean, nice. Let's come to the audience then, if that's okay. Can we have a first, a volunteer, a shock troupe of... Yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if maybe there's perhaps a bit of a contradiction in, on one hand, acknowledging the need for cheap housing or more affordable housing, but also recognizing that these new artist studios are increasing the value of neighbouring properties by 4.4%.
Do you want to?
Yeah, it's my slide. I think we need both. We need the affordable housing, and we need the affordable workspace. And artist studios, creative workspace isn't going to solve the capitalism problem. Artists need the affordable workspace, and so we're trying to tackle that. But there's no doubt that we need to make sure that the communities that are living in those localities are looked after as well. And policy needs to be able to be strong enough to solve that problem or help solve that problem. We hope that the work we're doing is also showing the other side, that isn't just that financial value, that the social value is really ingrained into what we're doing. And it's really important that we're not kind of helicoptering things in, that what's happening is reflective of what the community really wants and needs. And that the tenant base, the artists are from the local area, or as many of them as possible, so that the proportion of people in the spaces are reflective of the demographic of the population around. So I don't know what the answer is, but we're sort of working towards something step by step.
I think it's a really good point, though, because I think a lot of the time when you're working on these projects, there'll be some people that are really committed to the idea and see an inherent value in community space or art space. And then there are others that you might come across in the same project that don't understand why you're doing it. Like, what's the point of artists, or what's the point of community space? And that's where sometimes you need statistics to sort of prove your case of why art has a value. And that's where reports like the one Holly worked on, or I mean, I didn't know the statistic, but statistics like that, that's when you can speak to people from a completely different mindset, where you can somehow explain. Like we referred to the report when we had to explain to people that artists actually were in financial need, because then we could say, well, here's a report that says they only earn 10k a year, and then people had never even thought about the idea that artists are poor, or that they might need social housing. So I think that's where it helps to have use data in a context where people aren't necessarily agreeing with you. But yeah, there are always complex contradictions, I guess.
I think it's an interesting question, though, isn't it? I think it demonstrates the quandary of the whole system.
Yeah.
But probably too much to expect us to solve it tonight. Yes, there's a question right at the back, and then we'll come down to the front.
Is it on?
Oh, yeah.
This is for Eve at first. As part of your research of like where to put these studios, you might have already factored this in, but a lot of artists, especially in my studio, half of them live on boats, and we were literally discussing if we were going to move studios, where we were going to, and my friend I'm moving with, we're going to have to move somewhere that connects to like the Lee Bridge station line, because then it goes up where she's likely to live. And I was just wondering if, as part of factoring in where you're going to make plans to make studios in the future, you might think about researching where artists are likely to move to, or where they, because I know we're linking affordability and in future ideal worlds, but I think it would be a good part of research, if you're not already considering it, to say, where are you going to move to next? Because for example, Hackney, lots of people live there. I'm about to move out to Tottenham, and planning that trajectory, and then saying, okay, to meet the artist there, because obviously everything takes time. I just wondered if you considered that.
Thanks. Yeah. It's a balance. We need to populate the areas like Hackney, where there are studios being lost at a rapid rate. And, we've gone to Hackney Wick as a sort of first stop, as a kind of trying to sort of put a line in the sand for that attrition of studio spaces. But you're right, there are other areas where there's a real opportunity, because maybe the prices haven't quite gone up in the same way, and so there you could get more space generally, and sort of spread out a little bit more, and get more units, more studio units. We're looking at every borough at the moment. I mean, COVID had a bit of an impact, because we could only go as far as our bike ride will allow us to go during the time that we were looking at spaces. But now that the restrictions are over, we're looking as far afield as we can. And at the moment, we're in a kind of consolidation period where we're looking at the next round of funding. But we are looking at the pipeline for the next studios for 2023, 2024, and beyond. So thinking about where next is really important in that arc.
I think it's also interesting to think that there's a sort of natural movement which you can plot from whatever, Clerkenwell way back in the day to Hackney Wick, maybe towards Tottenham. And I remember having a conversation with a client in 2005, I think, in Tottenham. And when artists come here, then we'll know that we're doing the right thing. This will be great when artists come to Tottenham. And back then you're like, oh, wow, that is a long way off, mate. But it happened. And then the kind of contrast with what's happening in Barking and Dagenham, which is actually the 2014 study had, I think, almost no artist studios in Barking and Dagenham. And then it's a sort of artificial, engineered pull of artists to somewhere to drive the kind of change that they want to see. So there is a sort of, you describe the sort of waves, I think, of artists kind of flowing out of places, and that kind of more gradual picture of change versus maybe something which is slightly more constructed or deliberate in Barking and Dagenham. The Creative Land Trust could be in both of those places just as legitimately.
Yeah. We could also be on boats, though. I'm quite interested
yeah,
in that
boats.
idea. Is the studio? Is it just a work? Is it just a live space, or do you actually make art on your boat? Because I'm into that idea.
I was saying that people who rent in my studio space
Yeah.
live on boats.
Yeah. Okay.
But I was also thinking that, you know, as part of the research, you know, if you were going to look into if artists need, you know, social housing and things like that, the fact that lots of them do live on boats, I don't know if that's, you know, actually researched and written down, because they, you know, can only afford to be artists because of that, you know, very distinct way of living.
It's really interesting. I imagine somebody's thought about it. I hadn't really thought about the boating community as somewhere where we should look and capture the data as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. There was a question at the front, and then we'll come to this one up here, if that's okay.
Hi, I just have a thought based on the first question, which was about the artists and gentrification, and your first project, I forget where it was, but I wonder if that's kind of sort of maintaining the draw of the area after the fact, where it's attached to a development, and so that, in my mind, if there's a development and that shift has already started to happen, and so it's kind of holding on to the draw of the area, or maybe, like you said, pulling it, engineering it. I'm sorry, I forget where it was, but my main question was, on your slide about how the Creative Land Trust works, there was an arrow and it said partnerships with developers, local authorities and communities. And I suppose actually artists are like a fourth factor in that as a community. And I'm wondering, does the Creative Land Trust put some limits on where the relative levels of input are between those three groups? Because sort of in order, in my mind, that's where the power sort of decreases. And I wonder if you act to reverse that.
I think we interact with them in different ways. So artists are at the core of everything we do. That's the raison d'etre, is to make sure that artists are looked after and we don't lose them indefinitely to other places, although great for other places if they move to other places. So that's always at the sort of core of what we do, and you know, the idea of making sure that the rents are kind of, we work backwards always from what the artists really can pay, but we're always hoping to go back to the artists and sort of make sure that we're not getting slippage, and we're not sort of falling away from our mission. And then the community, secondary, the sort of more local community, the community at large, is crucial as well, because you want to make sure that you're not just a sort of sore thumb in a space, that you're actually doing something that's relevant. So with that information, you then kind of you can then go and present to X developer, Y property owner, and Z local authority. And that's how that's in Newham anyway. That's how we worked, is that we approached Newham after the kind of information that we had from the community.
Is part of your role mediating the tension between the three groups almost? Because I can see that, for example, a community would be averse to whatever a developer wants to do.
I suppose we act as a bit of a bridge, sort of a translator of different kinds of ways of thinking. It's not necessarily our role. I don't think we see it as our role to be the kind of voice of one or the other. But yeah, certainly when we're speaking to developers, it's sort of there's a kind of translating, trying to sort of gain trust. You know, sort of making people see that everyone is just sort of working towards a common goal. They're just coming from it in different ways.
And I think one point about House for Artists, about at least half the artists are actually from the area or very close. So I think it's a bit of a mix, because some actually went away from Barking as part of their practice and then came back. So if that's a pull factor, pulling people back to where they were originally from, or if people that have always been based there. So sometimes the artists and the community are one and the same. It's not always that these are two different, entirely separate groups. There can be quite an overlap as well.
Thanks. There was another question up by the aisle over here.
Hi. First of all, it's really interesting you're saying about boats. I'm a designer myself. My partner, we both live on a boat on the River Lee. He's a successful painter and has been hopping studios, it's been about 3 studios in the last 2 years. And we're always looking for planning permission, how long has this building got, And, so I was just saying, but my question is really about supporting spaces. So as well as, you mentioned it a little bit in the talks, but so artists have certain needs like painters, but also if your maker's space is very different. So things like kilns, shared facilities. How important do you think that is, and how do you think that works? And then on top of that, display spaces. So spaces, you talked about window frontage and the ground floor of properties, and that kind of is a very different space from the private, almost like you don't want anyone to see actually work in progress space. I wondered where you see that potential, or whether actually that's something that shouldn't really be part of these schemes. It should be something separate.
Well, I think it has to go into the thinking, like, throughout. I mean, we're guided by the studio providers who are our tenants who run the spaces as to how they see the spaces best being fitted out. And that's what's happening in our site on Wallace Road. One of our studio providers is providing pure visual artist space. Granted, you saw the sort of computer rendering, it's big glazed windows. So these spaces were imagined as retail units, so we're kind of retrofitting into those. But there are artists who are happy to kind of put their work out there and have it on display. But yeah, our other studio provider, who's a local studio provider, Techniwick, they're providing makerspace, so there'll be a mixture of different kinds of space. And I think you need, in this day and age, to provide a bit of everything. I mean, it'd be great to provide bespoke spaces, but you don't know who's necessarily going to take those spaces. So going back to that point around flexibility is really important, so that a tenant can bring in a kiln, but equally if they need to put up shelving to have storage, so that they can whack canvases up high and be making painting pictures and canvases at floor level, that should be possible. So a mixture. I don't know, it doesn't really answer the question maybe.
I mean, in House for Artists, we put in 2 different kinds of plug sockets, so that heavy machinery could also be plugged in, so that was already built into the infrastructure, or the things that are difficult to change. And also tried to make it possible that extra sinks could be added, but it was sort of unknown who would be using the space and what exactly they would need. So we just saw it as important to have some of the core infrastructure there, so that it was possible later if it's needed.
I just have a small bit to add on this, actually, because I mentioned that we're in the process of updating the previous 2014-2017 studies, and part of the update that we're currently working on is much broader, looking at different types of cultural infrastructure as well, including makerspace as a sort of separate subset of creative workspace. And from what we can see from the desk-based research so far, which is still to be supplemented by a wider survey that gives us more detail, so it's still kind of preliminary, but it looks like the impact on that kind of space of COVID has been more significant than it has on artist workspace more generally. And I think we can kind of understand why that would be, because that's shared facilities, and like being in your own artist studio is kind of safer and probably more necessary to get out of your house than just desk-based sort of professional services work. But the makerspace impact looks like that's been more significant. So maybe there's more work to be done on that, and maybe that's something to kind of factor into forward planning on the sorts of space that we're looking to secure and kind of take more care of going forward. But like I say, all very preliminary, but right now it looks like actually there's a greater loss in that sector as opposed to artist studios, as mapped previously.
I think it's important, though, that artist studios really are protected, though, because it goes back to that income thing of precarious incomes sometimes with an artist versus a maker who might have a more steady income. So making sure that those artist spaces really, they are prevalent and that they are protected, so that we don't, if there is a loss, that at least there's a core of those that are held on to.
So I'm getting a wave.
Yeah, no, I'm question.
Oh, a question. Oh, I thought it was like, get it off, get it off.
No, thank you. It's been such a brilliant discussion. You've talked a lot about London and East London in particular, and I just wonder, are there other national or international places that you're looking to that have alternative models? So Astrid, you talked a little bit about Switzerland, but are there other countries or other cities that you think have interesting models? And I guess with that in mind as well, how exceptional do you think East London is? Is it a useful example for others to compare their provision with?
Interesting.
So, yeah, we have looked a lot at Switzerland, but I don't know if they have the answers on studio space. I think they're quite progressive on their provision of affordable housing, and I think studio space is a work in progress there as much as here. So as I think a lot of industrial buildings have been demolished there, so the available space is diminished massively, and I think probably similar discussions have to be had there. So that's all I know about Switzerland specifically. I don't know if we've...
in San Francisco, the Creative Land Trust is partly based on an organization called CAST, the Community Arts Stabilization Trust in San Francisco. San Francisco's gone through a huge... We talk about sort of the gentrification issue in London. Well, San Francisco with Silicon Valley has had that kind of a really condensed and rapid rate. And CAST looks at cultural venues that need to be protected. So the organization buys up the property and then puts in an operator, and the operator, over a space of about a decade, buys the building at that original price off the trust. And so hopefully with that model, they proliferate across other buildings, other cultural venues around the city. We also know of an organization in Toronto called Artscape, who've been going for almost 30 years now, who provide workspace for the city and for artists specifically. So those are two main models, but there are lots of conversations, especially the Greater London Authority. They're doing a lot of work with, I've forgotten the name of the Cultural World Forum or something it's called. Do you know it?
Not sure.
It's gonna come to me in a minute anyway. So it's linking world cities, global cities, who are dealing with issues around space, essentially. Space as in urban space, and the cultural kind of offer within that. And that goes around the world. So there's they do regular seminars with different cities around the world. So there's a network out there of really interesting resources. And not to plug our website necessarily, but we've got a lot of resources on our website. If anybody's interested, I can share a link later for everybody. We've got quite a bit on there.
Great. Oh, there's still more questions. Can we take one more? One. I'm allowed one. You already had one, I'm afraid, so we're going to go to at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the idea of the finance to make these spaces. And the question I had is regarding financial independence. I'm interested to understand that so far the model of the Creative Land Trust is based on external input of money and therefore a financial dependence to fulfill your mission. I'm interested to know, are you not worried that this might dry out and therefore you cannot fulfill this purpose? And if you are, what are you creating in order to not be dependent of them?
Thanks. Yeah, we're hoping that the model will become self-sustaining over time. At the moment, it's not, because we have to prove that the model works. And to do that, you've got to have a working example that you can kind of point to. and go, look what we've done, and look what it does, and look how it helps the people in the building and the community at large and the cultural sector generally. And with that, we'll be able to hopefully bring in outside investment and actually start to make the thing not be reliant on donated money. But there will always be a bit of a blended form to it. But hopefully over time, it will mean that we'll become less and less dependent on that. And it becomes a bit more sort of rolling. But we've got a little bit of a way to go yet.
But there is this kind of slightly relates to the previous question actually as well, which in terms of examples from elsewhere. So Folkestone, where we've been doing a bit of work, has a really interesting model, which I don't think is replicable because you have to have a tame billionaire to make it work. But they do have one. So a gentleman called Roger DeHaan, who owned Saga, anyway, wealthy guy, very committed to Folkestone and kind of future of Folkestone, has bought up basically the whole of the old high street and is then leasing that endows it to a trust, which then operates it, leasing it at affordable levels to creative practitioners, both on the high street, kind of the sort of consumption-facing shopfront type of arrangement, as well as back-of-house production spaces. But the trust then is self-sustaining because of the endowment of the asset. So that, like I say, not easily replicable, but it gives us hope that models like yours can work with enough of a sort of portfolio of properties that you're able to manage and take even modest rents from. Still, yeah, if you have a spare billionaire, it'll be fine. Then you can do some really good stuff. But it just is interesting how other people kind of arrange things to make change. And the impact, the sort of bigger urban impact of that action in Folkestone is really kind of meaningful and significant. Not without challenges, but nonetheless big urban change and sort of change of perceptions as well, I think, of a whole town because of this action.
I think it's that conversation around trying to place the creative sector within the wider sector and give it relevance. Why invest in the arts? Why invest in culture? Why invest in creative production? What are all the other things? If you took out all of the cultural venues in London, what would London look like? And if we can start having that conversation and think about the studio as the kind of research and development, the lab for the creative sector, then people will start going, oh, okay, so my cinema, my trip to the cinema actually goes back to the studio. My trip to the museum goes back to the studio. Just before coming in, I went around the show at Whitechapel Gallery here, and I was watching a video made by Space Studios in the 70s with Bridget Riley and another artist, and they took on a massive building in East London back then, and they had to get I think it was Henry Moore. Is that possible? Was he around at that point?
Could be.
Henry Moore.
Let's say yes.
As their patron. And because they said we needed some financial help for the first building, that they took on. So way back in the 60s, when we're talking about, squatting buildings and there being more space, even then the arts needed a little bit of support to get going. So hopefully we can make it self-sustaining going forward.
That's great. That sounds like a really beautiful note to end it on. So we'd like to say thank you very much, Astrid. Thank you, Yves. Thanks all of you. Thanks for your questions. Really good.